April 3, 1951. Lenox Avenue and 125th Street. Harlem. One NYPD badge crossed the line by beating a 12-year-old girl to send a message to Bumpy Johnson. 6 hours later, 13 careers were already dead. This wasn't rage or revenge, it was a surgical strike on power. So how did one man dismantle an entire precinct without firing a shot to understand the end? We have to return to where it truly began. 1951. 3:47 in the afternoon. The corner of 125th Street and Lenox Avenue, where Harlem's heart beat loudest and where the city's indifference showed itself most clearly. A 12-year-old girl lay on the sidewalk, her school books scattered around her like fallen leaves. Her body curled in the defensive position of someone who had learned too young that the world could break you without warning. The stain spreading beneath her was still wet, still fresh, the kind of thing that made people look away because seeing it meant acknowledging that something had gone terribly wrong. 30 witnesses stood in windows and doorways, their faces visible behind glass and curtains. But not one of them stepped onto the street. They had learned long ago that being a witness in Harlem meant becoming a target, that speaking up meant getting a visit from men with badges who asked questions with their fists. Dennis Ali stood 10 feet away, badge number 4427 gleaming on his chest, his nightstick still in his right hand, breathing hard like a man who had just finished something that required effort. He looked up at the windows, at the faces watching him, and said something loud enough for everyone to hear. A message meant for the girl's father. Words designed to humiliate and threaten and establish that this was not an accident, but a deliberate act of violence. Tell your daddy that this is what happens when people forget their place. Tell him the streets belong to us, not him. The elevated train rattled past overhead, its wheels screeching against the rails. The smell of cigarette smoke mixed with the warm bread smell from the bakery 3 doors down. Somewhere in the darkness of a basement bar, a jukebox played Duke Ellington at half volume. The music floating up through the sidewalk grates like a ghost trying to remember what joy sounded like. The question hanging in the air was simple and terrifying. If the New York Police Department was willing to beat a child in broad daylight on one of the busiest streets in Harlem, if they were willing to do it knowing who her father was, then what safety existed for anyone else 16 minutes later? Bumpy Johnson walked through the doors of Harlem Hospital. He did not run. He did not shout. His face showed no anger, no tears, no emotion at all except for something cold and final in his eyes. The look of a man who had already made his decision and was now simply executing a plan that had been forming in his mind for longer than anyone realized. He found Margaret in a bed at the end of a long hallway that smelled like disinfectant and fear. Her face was swollen on the left side where the nightstick had connected. Her ribs were wrapped in bandages. A doctor stood nearby making notes on a clipboard. Bumpy asked 3 questions. Just 3. His voice never rose above a conversational tone, but each question landed with the precision of a scalpel cutting through skin. "What is broken?" the doctor answered. 3 ribs on the left side, hairline fracture of the jaw, possible internal bruising. We are monitoring for bleeding. How many witnesses saw it happen? Illinois Gordon appeared in the doorway behind Bumpy like a shadow that had been waiting for permission to become solid. Illinois was 40 years old, built like a man who had spent his youth loading cargo on the docks, and he had been Bumpy's right hand for 15 years. He ran the clean operations and the dirty ones with equal efficiency. 32 that we have names for. Illinois said. Curtis was on the corner. He saw the whole thing. Curtis was a man without a permanent address who Bumpy paid $20 a week to sit on street corners and watch. Most people dismissed him as just another casualty of Harlem's poverty. What they did not know was that Curtis had better eyes and ears than half the police informants in the city. What did Ali say? His exact words. Illinois pulled a small notebook from his pocket and read from it. He said, "Tell your daddy that this is what happens when people forget their place. Tell him the streets belong to us, not him." Bumpy stood beside the hospital bed looking down at his daughter. His hands were loose at his sides. His jaw was tight but not clenched. He looked like a man standing at a graveside, calm and composed and already thinking about what came next. "No one goes after Ali," Bumpy said. "Not tonight. Not tomorrow. No one touches him." Illinois frowned. "Boss, he put your girl in the hospital. You want us to just let that go?" "I did not say let it go," Bumpy replied. "I said do not touch him. There is a difference. Ali is not the problem. Ali is a symptom. The problem is the system that lets men like him put on a badge and terrorize a neighborhood because they know no one will stop them. We are not going after Ali. We are going after all of them." Illinois understood then. "The files. Everything," Bumpy said. "Every name, every payment, every conversation we recorded. Jerome has been keeping the books for 18 months. We have photographs. We have witnesses. We have bank records that show cops living on champagne budgets with beer salaries. Ali just gave us the reason to use it all." The door opened, and Jerome West entered, thin and precise, wearing wire-rimmed glasses and a brown suit. He was a former accountant who had spent 20 years working for a firm in Lower Manhattan before they decided that having a black man handle their books was bad for business. Bumpy had hired him the same week, and for the past decade, Jerome had been turning Bumpy's empire into something that looked legitimate on paper. Jerome nodded to Bumpy and held up a leather satchel. "I have everything ready. 14 sets. Each one is complete." "How long?" Bumpy asked. 6 hours if we move now." Bumpy looked at the clock on the wall. It was 4:15 in the afternoon. "We have until midnight. That gives Ali 6 hours as a cop. After midnight, he is just another man who made a mistake he cannot take back." He leaned down and kissed Margaret on the forehead, careful not to touch the bruises. "Where are we going?" Illinois asked. "Small paradise," Bumpy said. "The files are in the basement. 12 cabinets. 18 months of work. Tonight. We turn it into something they cannot ignore, cannot bury, and cannot survive." The basement of Small's Paradise was accessed through a door behind the bar. The 12 filing cabinets stood against the far wall like coffins made of steel and paper. Each one was labeled with a number and contained documentation of corruption so systematic that releasing it would be like detonating a bomb inside the New York Police Department. Bumpy opened the first cabinet and pulled out a file an inch thick. Inside were photographs of Dennis Ali accepting cash from a numbers runner. The photos were dated, time-stamped, and so clear you could see the denomination of the bills. Below the photographs were bank statements showing deposits that Ali had made in amounts that did not match his police salary. There were recordings of conversations where Ali discussed prices with business owners, where he explained how much they needed to pay each month to avoid inspections, citations, and arrests. There were witness statements from people who had been shaken down, beaten, threatened. There was a ledger in Ali's own handwriting, a small notebook where he kept track of who had paid and who still owed. And that ledger was the key that would unlock everything else. Because you could deny photographs, you could claim recordings were faked, you could intimidate witnesses into changing their stories. But you could not deny your own handwriting documenting your own crimes. Bumpy closed the file and looked at Illinois and Jerome. "We have 6 hours to build 14 boxes, 13 for each cop we are taking down, 1 for the FBI. Each box needs to be complete, organized, impossible to dismiss. By midnight, every corrupt cop in the 28th Precinct is going to have a choice: resign tonight or face federal charges in the morning. Dennis Ali was 38 years old and had been with the NYPD for 15 years. On paper, he was a model officer, commendations for bravery, community service awards. His personnel file read like the biography of a man who believed in law and order. The reality was different. Ali was a thief who had figured out that wearing a badge meant you could steal without consequences. The system Ali had built was simple and brutal. Every black-owned business in his patrol area paid $50 a month. That payment bought them protection from surprise health inspections, from citations for minor violations that white-owned businesses committed every day without penalty. If you ran numbers, the price went up. $100 a week, paid in cash, delivered personally. In exchange, Ali made sure the raids happened on the wrong blocks at the wrong times. If you refused to pay, Ali had ways of making you reconsider. A broken window. A cousin was arrested on trumped-up charges. A fire inspection that found violations requiring thousands of dollars in repairs. Ali lived well beyond his salary. He owned a house in Queens with a 2-car garage. He drove a 1949 Buick Roadmaster that cost more than he made in a year. His children attended a private school where the annual tuition equaled 6 months of his official income. When he stood next to his patrol car waiting for someone to bring him an envelope, he would tap his fingers on the hood in a specific rhythm. His fingers always smelled like cheap cigarettes. When he walked, his leather shoes hit the sidewalk with a sound like a hammer striking concrete. At 5:15 in the afternoon on April 3rd, 1951, while Dennis Ali was writing his incident report about subduing a juvenile with necessary force, Bumpy Johnson was gathering 5 men in a room above a barber shop on 132nd Street. Illinois Gordon sat in a chair by the window. Willie Barnes, who ran the numbers operation on the west side, leaned against the wall. Marcus Cole, an enforcer whose reputation for breaking kneecaps had made him legendary, stood near the door. Quick Eddie Thompson, who could pick any lock in the city, sat at the table, and Jerome West stood beside a chalkboard where he had written 13 names. Bumpy entered carrying a bottle of Barolo from 1934. He uncorked it and poured small glasses. The smell filled the room, rich and bitter. Everyone took a glass, but no one drank. They waited for Bumpy to speak. 18 months ago, Bumpy said, we started documenting every corrupt cop in the 28th Precinct, every bribe, every shakedown, every threat. Jerome kept the books. Illinois ran the surveillance. We took photographs. We made recordings. We collected witness statements. He held his glass without drinking. Today, Dennis Ali put my daughter in the hospital. He broke her ribs. He fractured her jaw. He did it in broad daylight because he wanted to send me a message. What Ali does not understand is that I have been preparing for this moment for 18 months. He is not the target. He is the catalyst. Jerome stepped forward and pointed at the chalkboard. These are the officers we have documentation on. Dennis Ali, Frank Morrison, the captain, 11 others who are part of the protection racket. Each one has been taking money from this community. Each one has left a trail we can prove. Bumpy picked up chalk and drew a line under the 13 names. He wrote a single word at the bottom, FBI. Here is how this works, he said. Step 1. We create 14 packages, 13 individual files, one for each cop. Each file contains everything we have: photographs, recordings, bank statements, witness testimony, copies of the ledger where Ali wrote down who paid and when. He tapped the chalk on the board. Step 2. We create a 14th package that contains copies of everything. This package is marked for the FBI. It is our insurance. If the NYPD tries to bury this, the FBI gets everything. Step 3. We give them a deadline. Midnight tonight. They have 6 hours to resign. All 13 of them. If they walk away tonight, we keep the files sealed. If they refuse, the FBI package gets delivered at 9 in the morning. Illinois stood up. What if they come after us? Then the files go public, immediately. Bumpy said, I have people standing by. If I do not make a phone call every 2 hours, they open the packages and start distributing them. Willie spoke from his position against the wall. Why give them a choice? Why not just send it to the FBI and let them all burn? Bumpy took a small sip of wine. Because I want them to understand what happened. I want them to know they had a choice, that they could have walked away. Revenge is making someone disappear. Justice is making them live with what they did. Jerome cleared his throat. Creating 14 complete packages is going to take time. We have the documentation, but it needs to be organized, indexed, cross-referenced. This has to look professional, like something a prosecutor would build for a federal case. How long do you need? Bumpy asked. 4 hours if we do not make mistakes. You have 4, Bumpy said, because at 10 o'clock tonight, we will deliver the ultimatum, and at midnight, either 13 cops resign, or we bring down the entire precinct. He raised his glass. To Margaret, and to make sure this never happens to another child in Harlem. They drank. The wine was bitter, dark, and heavy. No one smiled. They swallowed the cold weight of what they were about to do and got to work. Jerome began pulling out files, laying them across the table in neat stacks. Illinois left to gather surveillance photographs. Willie and Marcus went to collect witness statements. Quick Eddie started setting up a small printing press in the corner, an hour into the work. Jerome pulled something from one of the files that made everyone stop. It was a small notebook with a black cover worn smooth by handling. The pages inside were filled with Dennis Ali's handwriting, neat columns of names and numbers and dates. This is the ledger, Jerome said, holding it up. Ali kept it to himself. Every business that paid protection, every number runner who handed over their cut. All of it documented in his own hand. He opened a random page and read aloud. March 15th, Coleman's Grocery, $50. Martinez Bodega, $50. Johnson's Barbershop, $50. Raymond Cole, $100. Total for the week, $2,400. The room went quiet. Bumpy walked over and took the notebook. He flipped through the pages, looking at the careful records Ali had kept. How did we get this? Bumpy asked. Ali keeps it in his locker at the precinct. Illinois answered. Curtis watched him write in it every Friday. We had someone photograph every page 3 months ago. What you are holding is a copy. The original is still in his locker. Huh. Bumpy closed the notebook and set it down. This is what breaks them. You can claim photographs are staged. You can say recordings are edited. You can intimidate witnesses. But you cannot explain away your own handwriting in your own ledger documenting your own corruption. He looked around the room. Make sure every package includes copies of this. Make sure it is the first thing they see when they open the file. I want Ali to look at his own handwriting and understand that he destroyed himself. Jerome made a note. There is one more thing. According to the ledger, Ali has been paying Captain Morrison $500 a month. The payments are documented going back 14 months. Ali writes it down as an insurance payment. Bumpy absorbed this without visible reaction. So Morrison is not just looking the other way. He is actively profiting from the protection racket. That is correct, Jerome said. Bumpy walked back to the window and looked out at Harlem, at the lights coming on as evening fell. Then Morrison goes down too. All of them. The whole rotten structure gets torn apart tonight. He turned back to face the room. 4 hours, 14 packages, and then we deliver a message that will echo through every precinct in this city. The work continued. The files grew thicker. The packages took shape. And outside, the sun set over Harlem, leaving only the darkness and the cold certainty that before this night was over. 13 men were going to learn that power without accountability always ends the same way. The room above the barbershop on 132nd Street had transformed into a war room. Except the weapons being assembled were not guns or knives, but documents, photographs, and recordings that would cut deeper than any blade. Bumpy understood the risk. The 28th Precinct had people who specialized in making evidence disappear, who could walk into a records room and burn files without anyone asking questions. They had connections to judges who would issue warrants based on fabricated probable cause. They had enforcers who knew how to make witnesses reconsider their testimony by breaking fingers one joint at a time until cooperation seemed like the only reasonable option. If Morrison and his crew learned what was happening before the ultimatum was delivered, they would move fast. They would arrest Bumpy and his men on whatever charges they could manufacture. By morning, the entire operation would be buried under a mountain of procedural objections and missing evidence. The sound of the printing press filled the room, a mechanical rhythm like a heartbeat that refused to stop. Quick Eddie fed pages into the machine, his hands moving with the precision of a man who had spent years cracking safes. Carbon paper stained his fingers black. The smell of ink hung heavy in the air, thick and chemical. Jerome worked at the main table, organizing documents into stacks with methodical efficiency. Each file had to be complete, cross-referenced, indexed in a way that would make sense to a federal prosecutor who needed to understand exactly how the corruption worked. Willie and Quick handled the recordings, duplicating the magnetic tapes onto backup reels. The conversations they were copying were damning in their casual brutality. Ali talking to a bodega owner about protection costs. Morrison discussed with his lieutenant how to split the take. 11 other voices, all documenting their own crimes with the confidence of men who believed they would never be held accountable. Marcus moved through the room collecting witness statements that had been stored in 3 different locations. Each statement had been notarized, dated, and stored with Reverend Thomas, who understood that keeping secrets was sometimes the most sacred duty a man of God could perform. Illinois was outside, moving between 3 cars parked on different blocks, checking for surveillance, making sure no unmarked police vehicles were circling the area. He had a radio in each car tuned to the police band, listening for any chatter about unusual activity in Harlem. The work proceeded in stages. Jerome created the master index for each file. Quick Eddie printed multiple copies of the photographs. Willie organized the recordings by officer, creating timelines. Marcus compiled the witness statements chronologically, building a narrative that would be impossible to dismiss. By 8 o'clock, the first 3 boxes were complete. Each one contained a full set of evidence against a specific officer. Photographs of them accepting bribes, recordings of them discussing prices and territories, bank statements showing deposits that could not be explained by their salaries, witness statements describing specific acts of extortion and violence. And in each box, prominently displayed on top, was a copy of Dennis Ali's ledger, the handwritten record that proved this was not a misunderstanding, but a systematic operation that had been running for years. In one corner of the room, near the window, stood a small wooden cross. Bumpy walked over to it during a break in the work. He reached out and touched the cross with 2 fingers, not in prayer, but in acknowledgement. He did not kneel. He did not close his eyes. He simply stood there for 10 seconds, his hand on the wood, marking the moment, and then turned back to the work. At 9:30, Illinois came into the room moving faster than usual. We have a problem. The patrol car just did 2 slow passes on Lennox. Same car. Same 2 cops. They are looking for something. Bumpy did not stop working. Did they stop? No, but they will be back. How long do we have? 30 minutes. Maybe 45 if we are lucky. Jerome looked up from his work, his face pale. We have 5 boxes left to complete. If we rush, we will make mistakes. Bumpy picked up one of the completed boxes and felt its weight. How long do you need to finish properly? 2 hours, Jerome said. You have one, Bumpy replied. Everyone doubles up. We deliver at 10:30 instead of 11. We cut the timeline short, but we get it done before they come back with a search warrant. The pace increased. The printing press ran faster. Jerome's hands moved across the documents like a card dealer working 3 tables at once. Willie copied index pages so fast the pen left smudges. But the information was accurate. At 9:45, Margaret woke up in her hospital bed. The nurse called the number Bumpy had left, and Illinois took the call. He came back into the room and found Bumpy sealing the 13th box. Your daughter is awake. She is asking for you. Bumpy stopped. He looked at the boxes stacked against the wall. 11 completed. 3 still in progress. He looked at the clock showing 9:47. Can it wait? Illinois shook his head. The nurse said she is agitated, asking for you specifically. She needs to see that you are okay. For the first time that night, Bumpy's hands stopped moving. He stood perfectly still, caught between 2 responsibilities that both demanded his immediate attention. Jerome, how long will it take to finish the last 3 of 40 minutes if nothing goes wrong? Bumpy made his decision. Illinois, you are in charge until I get back. Finish the boxes. Load them in the Cadillac. If I am not back by 10:20, you deliver them without me. Illinois nodded. I understand. Bumpy drove to Harlem Hospital in silence. The corridors were lit by fluorescent lights that made everything look sick and pale. The smell of disinfectant burned in his nose. He found Margaret's room and walked in to see her sitting up in bed, her face still swollen. She looked at him and asked the question he had been dreading. Are you going to kill him? Bumpy sat down and took her hand carefully. No. Why not? Because killing him would be easy. It would make me feel better for about 10 minutes, and then it would be over, and nothing would change. The next cop just like him would show up tomorrow and do the same thing to someone else's daughter. Margaret's fingers tightened around his hand. So what are you going to do? I am going to make sure he can never hurt anyone again. I am going to take away his badge, his career, his freedom. I am going to make sure every cop in this city knows that there are consequences for what he did. Will it work? Yes. He stayed for 5 more minutes, holding her hand until she fell back asleep. Then he walked to the small chapel near the emergency ward entrance. The chapel was empty and cold. Wind came through cracks around the windows. A single electric candle burned on the altar. Bumpy walked to the front and stood facing the cross. He did not kneel. He did not pray. He simply stood there for 2 minutes, his hands at his sides, his breathing slow and controlled. The cold bit into his skin. His breath came out in small clouds that dissipated in the darkness. What he was doing was not asking for forgiveness. It was making a final confirmation with himself, a last chance to walk away. Because once those boxes were delivered, there would be no going back. Lives would be ruined. Careers would end. Some of those cops might go to prison for a decade or more. He thought about Margaret lying in that hospital bed. He thought about all the other children in Harlem who had been hurt by men with badges, who believed they were untouchable. He turned and walked out of the chapel. The decision was made. 10 o'clock at night. A black Cadillac pulled to a stop in front of the 28th Precinct building on West 123rd Street. The engine cut off. The headlights died. Illinois Gordon sat in the driver's seat watching the precinct entrance. Two cops stood outside smoking, their breath visible in the cold air. Inside, through the glass doors, he could see the desk sergeant processing paperwork, a drunk sleeping it off on a bench. This was the most dangerous part. Walking into a police station carrying evidence that would destroy 13 careers was the equivalent of walking into a wolf's den wearing a suit made of meat. If they decided to hold Illinois and Willie, if they confiscated the boxes, the entire plan would collapse. Willie sat in the passenger seat, his jaw tight. "Are you sure about this?" "No," Illinois said, "but we are doing it anyway." They got out and opened the trunk. 14 boxes sat inside. Illinois and Willie each grabbed 3 boxes and started walking toward the precinct entrance. The sound of their footsteps echoed off the buildings. The streetlights cast long shadows. Somewhere in the distance, a jazz club was still playing music, the sound carrying through the cold night air. The two cops smoking outside watched them approach. One of them, a sergeant with 20 years on the force, straightened up. "What is this delivery for Captain Morrison?" Illinois said, his voice flat and calm. "He is expecting it. At 10 o'clock at night. That is when we were told to deliver it." The sergeant looked at the boxes, at Illinois' face, at Willie standing beside him. Something in their expressions made him step aside and let them pass. He had been a cop long enough to recognize when men were not afraid. And men who were not afraid of walking into a police station at night were men you did not want to provoke. Illinois and Willie walked through the doors and set the boxes down on the desk sergeant's counter. The desk sergeant, a fat man named O'Brien, looked at the boxes like they were ticking. "What is this?" Illinois pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket and laid it on top of the boxes. The envelope was white, clean, with a single name typed on the front, Captain Frank Morrison. "These need to go to Morrison immediately. All 14 boxes. He needs to see them tonight." O'Brien picked up the envelope but did not open it. "What is in the boxes?" "That is between Morrison and the people who sent them. But if I were you, I would make sure he gets them in the next 10 minutes. Because what is in those boxes affects more than just him." O'Brien's face went pale. "Who sent them?" "Read the letter," Illinois said. "Everything you need to know is in there." Illinois and Willie turned and walked back outside, got into the Cadillac, and drove away. They did not speed. They did not run. They simply drove at normal speed back toward Harlem. "You think they will open them?" Willie asked. "They will open them," Illinois said, "because they will not be able to help themselves." 15 minutes later, Captain Frank Morrison was called down from his office. He arrived irritated, expecting some routine issue. Instead, he found 14 boxes stacked on the counter and O'Brien looking like a man who had just seen his own funeral. "What is this?" Morrison asked. "They said you were expecting it." O'Brien replied. Morrison picked up the envelope with his name on it. He tore it open and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The language was formal, cold, precise. "To Captain Frank Morrison and the officers named below. This package contains documented evidence of systematic corruption within the 28th Precinct. Included are photographs, audio recordings, financial records, and witness statements covering an 18-month period. Box 14 contains duplicate copies of all evidence and will be delivered to the Federal Bureau of Investigation at 0900 hours tomorrow morning, unless the following conditions are met. All 13 officers named below must submit written resignations effective immediately. Resignations must be received by midnight tonight. This is not a negotiation. Below the text was a list of 13 names: Dennis Ali, Frank Morrison, 11 others. Morrison's hands began to shake. He set the letter down and looked at the boxes. "Get everyone on this list. I want them here in 30 minutes. I do not care if they are off duty. Get them here now." O'Brien picked up the phone and started making calls. Morrison opened the first box, the one labeled with Dennis Ali's name. Inside was a file organized with the precision of a legal brief. Photographs of Ali accepting cash from known criminals. Audio recordings, transcribed and indexed. Financial records showing deposits that did not match salary. And the ledger. Morrison opened it and saw page after page of Ali's handwriting. Names, dates, amounts. A complete record of everyone who paid protection money. It was Ali's own evidence against himself. Morrison closed the box and opened his own. Inside was the same systematic organization. Photographs of him meeting with Ali, with other officers. Recordings of conversations where he discussed splitting the money. Bank statements for an account under his wife's maiden name. Showing deposits of $500 a month going back 14 months. By 10:45, all 13 officers had arrived at the precinct. They crowded into the captain's office, looking at the boxes spread across Morrison's desk. Dennis Ali picked up the box with his name on it and opened it. He looked at the photographs. He looked at the recordings. He looked at the ledger, his own handwriting staring back at him. "This is fabricated," Ali said, but his voice carried no conviction. "This is Bumpy Johnson trying to frame us." Morrison looked at him with the expression of a man watching someone drown. "Frame us with your own handwriting. Frame us with photographs that show our faces, with recordings of our voices. Tell me how he fabricated that." Ali's mouth opened and closed without sound. One of the other officers said what everyone was thinking. "We arrest Johnson. We confiscate the evidence and bury it." Morrison shook his head. "Read the letter again. Box 14 goes to the FBI at 9 in the morning if we do not resign. You think arresting Johnson stops that they have copies. They have backups. They have people standing by to deliver everything if we make the wrong move." The room went silent. The clock on Morrison's wall ticked toward 11. "So what do we do?" Ali asked. Morrison sat down behind his desk and pulled out a piece of paper. He picked up a pen and began writing. "We resign. We write the letters now. We submit them before midnight, and we pray that whoever put this together keeps their word. And if they do not keep their word, then we go to prison," Morrison said. "But at least if we resign now, we have a chance of walking away. If we fight, we guarantee that everyone in this room ends up in a federal cell." The clock kept ticking. 11:15, 11:30, one by one. The 13 officers wrote their resignation letters. Some of them cried. Some sat in angry silence. Dennis Ali's hand shook so badly he had to rewrite his letter 3 times. At 11:43, 17 minutes before midnight, the last resignation was completed. Morrison collected all 13 letters, put them in a manila envelope, and sealed it. "Get out," Morrison said. "All of you. Clear out your lockers. Turn in your badges. Be gone before morning." They filed out one by one. Men who had worn badges for years, who had believed they were untouchable, who had learned tonight that power without accountability always ends the same way. Morrison sat at his desk staring at the boxes, his mind cycling through options that all ended badly. He could arrest Bumpy Johnson on fabricated charges, plant evidence, make the problem disappear the way problems in Harlem usually disappeared. He could send men to Curtis's corner, break his legs in 3 places, make sure the primary witness never made it to a courtroom. He could stage a raid on the barber shop, confiscate the evidence, burn it in the precinct furnace, but the letter had been clear. Box 14 goes to the FBI at 9 in the morning. Not might go. Will go. And if Bumpy Johnson had been smart enough to compile this much evidence, he was smart enough to have copies stored in places Morrison would never find. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Fight and guarantee federal charges. Resign and maybe walk away with nothing worse than a destroyed career. Morrison looked at the 13 men crowded into his office. Write the letters. All of you. Effective immediately. We submit before midnight. And maybe this ends here. Dennis Ali's voice came out strangled. And if they do not keep their word, if we resign and they send the files anyway. Morrison looked at him with exhaustion. Then we pray that resigning bought us something. But we are done either way. Ali, the only question is how much worse you want to make it. The clock showed 11:43, 17 minutes until midnight. One by one, the officers pulled out paper and began writing. The room filled with the sound of pens scratching, of grown men composing the sentences that would end careers they had spent decades building. Some wrote quickly, getting it over with. Others wrote slowly, each word a negotiation with themselves. Dennis Ali's hand shook so badly he tore through the paper twice. The third attempt came out barely legible. His handwriting degraded to something a child might produce. All the precision stripped away by the understanding that he had destroyed himself by keeping a ledger. At 11:57, 3 minutes before midnight, the last officer signed. Morrison collected the 13 letters, checked each one, and slid them into a manila envelope that he sealed with hands that had stopped shaking because there was nothing left to be nervous about. "Get out," Morrison said. "All of you. Go home. Pack your things. By morning, you need to be invisible. No statements to the press. No calls to lawyers. You walk away quiet. And maybe you stay out of prison. You make noise. And I guarantee Bumpy Johnson will make sure every news outlet in the city gets copies of those files." The 13 men filed out, moving through the precinct building one last time as police officers. Dennis Ali stopped on the front steps and looked out at Harlem. It was nearly midnight. The streets were quieter than usual, but not empty. Music drifted from a bar 2 blocks away. The neighborhood looked the same, but something had changed. For 15 years, he had walked these streets as someone who extracted tribute, who wore a badge that meant he could hurt people without consequences. Tonight, he understood that Harlem had never been just a neighborhood to exploit. It had been a community with teeth, and he had finally pushed hard enough to feel them close around his throat. Illinois Gordon pulled up in front of the precinct at 11:52. He walked inside, went to Morrison's office, and picked up the manila envelope without saying a word. Morrison watched him take it and did not try to stop him. Illinois drove back to the barber shop where Bumpy Johnson was waiting. He placed the envelope on the table. All 13, signed and dated, submitted with 5 minutes to spare. Bumpy opened the envelope and read each letter carefully, his face showing no emotion. He read them the way a judge might read a verdict, confirming that a process had been followed correctly. When he finished, he looked at Illinois. "Good. Now we call the FBI." Illinois frowned. They resigned. That was the deal. Bumpy shook his head. They resigned because they were caught. Not because they understood what they did was wrong. Not because they felt remorse. They resigned to save themselves. That is not justice. That is damage control. So what is justice? Justice is consequences, Bumpy said. Justice is making sure that when these men look back on their lives, they think about the years they spent in federal prison, about the moment they realized that stealing from Harlem cost them everything. He picked up the phone and dialed. The call was answered by a voice that identified itself as Special Agent Mitchell, Federal Bureau of Investigation. This is Bumpy Johnson. I have evidence of systematic corruption in the NYPD 28th Precinct. 14 boxes of documentation. Photographs, recordings, financial records, witness statements. I can deliver them to your office at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. There was a pause. What kind of evidence? The kind that sends people to prison, Bumpy said. The kind that shows a pattern of extortion, bribery, and abuse of power going back 18 months. The kind that comes with a ledger written in the defendant's own handwriting. I will need to verify this. You will have everything you need tomorrow at 9, Bumpy said. Federal Building, downtown. I will personally deliver the evidence and provide testimony. Be ready to open a case, because what I am giving you is airtight. He hung up and looked at Illinois. Now it is done. 9 o'clock in the morning. Bumpy Johnson walked into the Federal Building in Lower Manhattan carrying a leather satchel. Jerome West accompanied him with 2 additional boxes on a hand truck. They were met by Special Agent Mitchell and 2 assistant U.S. attorneys. The meeting took place in a conference room on the 14th floor. Bumpy set the satchel on the table and began removing files, laying them out in organized stacks while Jerome provided commentary on the indexing system and chain of evidence. For 3 hours, the federal agents and prosecutors examined the documentation. They listened to recordings of police officers discussing protection payments. They looked at photographs of money changing hands. They reviewed bank statements showing deposits inconsistent with police salaries. They read witness statements from 43 people describing being extorted, threatened, or assaulted. And they examined Dennis Ali's ledger, the handwritten record that turned everything from allegations into proof. By noon, the decision was made. The FBI would open a formal investigation. Subpoenas would be issued. Grand jury proceedings would begin within 30 days. The U.S. Attorney's Office would handle prosecution personally, treating this as a federal civil rights matter. The investigation moved fast. By May, arrest warrants had been issued for all 13 officers. By June, indictments had been handed down. By September, the trials were complete. Dennis Ali received 8 years in federal prison. The judge noted that Ali's own ledger had made prosecution almost trivial. Ali sat in the courtroom understanding that his compulsive need to keep records had been the instrument of his own destruction. Frank Morrison received 10 years. The additional charges of conspiracy and obstruction stemmed from his role in organizing the protection racket. He was 62 when he entered prison. He would be 72 when he got out, if he lived that long. 10 of the other 11 officers received sentences ranging from 4 to 7 years. One who cooperated fully received probation and permanent dismissal from law enforcement. Margaret Johnson recovered from her physical injuries within 6 weeks. The fractured jaw healed. The broken ribs mended. The bruises faded. But the psychological damage lasted longer. She had nightmares about men in uniforms, about being alone on streets where no one would help her. Bumpy drove her to school every morning for 2 years. He walked her to the door. He waited until she was inside before leaving. He did not explain why. He simply showed up, every day, until the nightmares started coming less frequently. Years later, Margaret graduated from Howard University Law School. She became a civil rights attorney, specializing in cases of police misconduct and corruption. She never spoke publicly about what had happened to her in 1951, but everyone who knew her understood that the work she did was built on understanding that the law could be both a weapon and a shield. Among her father's effects after he passed, Margaret found a letter that had never been sent. It was written in Dennis Ali's handwriting, dated April 5th, 1951, addressed to Bumpy Johnson. I thought I was untouchable. I thought the badge meant I could do whatever I wanted and no one would stop me. I was wrong. You taught me that. You taught all of us that. Margaret read the letter once, then stored it with other documents from that period. She never responded. There was nothing to say. The lesson her father had taught Dennis Ali was not delivered through words. It was delivered through consequences. In Harlem, the effect of the prosecutions rippled through the neighborhood. The 28th Precinct, facing federal oversight, cleaned house. Officers who had been taking bribes for years suddenly retired or transferred. The new captain implemented policies requiring financial disclosures and random audits. Complaint procedures were reformed. The protection racket did not disappear entirely, because corruption is like water and finds cracks in any system. But it became more careful, more restrained, aware that the community had demonstrated the ability to fight back with something more powerful than violence. The people of Harlem learned something that April. They learned that documentation could be a weapon. They learned that patience and preparation could accomplish what riots sometimes could not. They learned that the system could be made to work, not because it was designed to protect them, but because they could force it to protect them by making the cost of ignoring them too high to bear. Bumpy Johnson never spoke publicly about what he had done. He gave no interviews. He made no speeches. He simply continued running his operations in Harlem, and people understood that he had rewritten the rules in ways that would last long after he was gone. Revenge is making your enemy disappear. Justice is forcing them to live with the consequences of their actions, to wake up every morning in a prison cell and understand exactly how they got there. Real power does not come from violence. It comes from intelligence, from documentation, from the patience to wait for the right moment and the discipline to execute a plan so thoroughly that your enemies have no choice except surrender. The new order was established, not with guns but with files, not with threats but with evidence, not with fear but with the cold certainty that actions have consequences, and that sooner or later, those consequences arrive whether you are ready for them or not. After the trials, the 28th Precinct became a cautionary tale whispered in locker rooms across the city. 13 officers gone to federal prison because one of them kept a ledger, because they thought Harlem was too poor, too disorganized, too powerless to fight back. They learned otherwise, and every cop in New York learned with them. This story is shared for historical insight and personal reflection, not to promote violence or illegal behavior. Thank you for watching until the end. These stories take weeks of research and writing to create. If this resonated with you, if you see the lesson Bumpy Johnson was teaching about accountability and education over violence, hit that subscribe button. Help us reach 1 million subscribers so we can keep telling stories that matter. Stories about power used wisely. Stories about consequences faced honestly. Stories about men who chose to change systems instead of just destroying enemies. The next video drops soon. Until then, remember, real power is not what you can destroy. It is what you choose to build.